Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to Moving Forward on Racial Equity, a Conversation. This town hall is being sponsored Action. Can you hear me? Okay. 2020 has been a challenging year, to say the least. This worldwide pandemic has exposed all the inequities of America, especially racial inequality. During the earlier months of sheltering in place, people had little to do but watch TV and eat. People watched the TV news coverage of the police murder of George Floyd over and over and over again. The impact of America's sin of slavery was front and center and on TV every night. When discussing slavery in America, the issue of reparations ultimately comes up. This town hall will discuss the current national picture about racial equity and reparations in America, which will include a discussion on House Bill 40, which is a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Our distinguished panelists today are Dr. Nina Ahmad, who is on the board of directors of NOW and a former president of the Philadelphia chapter of NOW. Attorney Michael Coard from Avenging the Ancestors. Brittany Alston from the Action Center on Race and the Economy, and Congressman Dwight Evans, who's a co-sponsor of House Bill 40. Our special guest is Christine Nunes, the national president of NOW. Today's program will include a video titled HR 40, a National Plan for Reparations. We'll have a special guest speaker, which I've already identified, panel discussion of the topic, and Q&A.
Vanessa.
Okay. All right, can y'all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, when did I stop? When did you stop being able to hear me?
When you said Q&A was the last thing we heard.
Okay, and so let's begin the program. That was it.
So you were to cue me. I am going to speak now and introduce Christian Nunes.
Yes, please.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Nina Ahmed. I am so happy to be here today with all of you. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the president of the National Organization for Women, Christian Nunes. She is the second Black woman to lead NOW, Eileen Clark Hernandez being the first person who unfortunately passed away in 2017. She was the president for NOW between 1970 and 71. It's been a long time since the last president was a Black woman. Christian has many wonderful attributes and qualifications, including being a licensed clinical social worker. She's a consultant and a minority woman-owned business owner since 2006. She has her bachelor's and her master's and an MBA. She is extremely qualified, as you can see, and you can read all about her on the website of National Organization for Women. But what I wanted to do today is to really underscore her courage. In the face of racism within NOW, she was not willing to be quiet and accepted. That is why she's our president today. I was part of a group called the Radical 9 who supported Christian during this transition of NOW for her to become the leader. Christian stands at that intersection of being a woman and being Black. and we're going to talk much more about that. But without further ado, Christian, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Nina, and thank you, Philadelphia Now and Pennsylvania Now, for having me as your guest today on this extremely important topic that you all are having, talking about racial equity. I think this is an absolute important time to have this town hall. As Vanessa pointed out earlier, I mean, what we have seen this last year in 2020, honestly, what we have been living decades, repeated decades over and over again, has just really brought us to a point where we really need to have a constant, honest, unapologetic conversations about racial equity and reparations, and really truthful conversations about why we need to continue to push for these things, and also HB 40. I thank Nina for her courage as well, being a national board member and always being unapologetic and honest and speaking the truth. So I thank her for her courage as well and her honesty on the board. She's always been a person I can rely on to always be of integrity on this board. So thank you, Nina, for your role. So I just wanted to share a couple words. As the national president for now, we were founded in 1966, as you all know, but a couple years ago in 2015, we have a big, huge change in our bylaws where we adopted the term intersectionality. And it was with Kimberly Crenshaw. Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw actually came to our conference in New Orleans, Louisiana, and spoke and shared with us. And we took on intersectionality and adopting it into our mission and our purpose. Well, one of the things I want to point out is I think sometimes the word intersectionality loses its core value and its core purpose. But we took it on and we said that we will make sure that we become an organization that takes action through intersectionality and intersectionality grassroots and grassroots activism. So here I am now, and I want to make sure that now takes this and becomes very purposeful in the work that we do with intersectionality, but the true core meaning of intersectionality. And what intersectionality is really talking about is really understanding how power collides and how power collides with not only things like race, but gender and class and disability status, and how it intersects together and causes and leads to oppression. And I think we have to talk about that as we talk about racial equity and really understand that it's not saying we're going to work on only issues of LGBTQIA or only issues of gender. We have to talk about how all these things play in together and how they lead to oppression. And so when we're working on these groups as feminists and women, that we have to look at how they truly impact racial oppression and racial justice. And we can't be true feminists in an organization if we are not working from a racial equity lens, or we are not addressing racial equity. So now's mission we committed to in 2019 was to take on a long-term commitment to racial equity by not only doing racial equity trainings and racial justice trainings, but also committing to look at our own structures, our own policies and procedures at our organization and through our bylaws to change those so that we are making sure that the work that we are doing is going to be looking at it from a racial equity perspective and lens and an intersectional perspective and lens. So we can't say that we are truly an organization that's looking at things from an intersectional perspective if our bylaws are oppressive, or our bylaws are ways that we are disenfranchising our membership, our women of color in our organization. So I'm here to let you know that we are true about our commitment, and we want to make sure that the work we do is going to be about racial equity and trying to eliminate any type of inequalities that are happening within our organization so that we can be effective allies that are working from an intersectional perspective. And I also want to say that I'm really happy that you all are taking this town hall and moving forward to talk about HB 40, because this is the first bill that really truly is talking about the impact that slavery and chattel slavery and slavery throughout the time has had on the African American people on a psychosocial level, past just, it's looking at multiple levels and what it has done for African Americans and impact, and really looking at it. So I'm looking forward to HIP's discussion and what you guys plan on doing from there. And I just thank you for being courageous to have this conversation and moving forward. And just thank you for having me today. And any way that now can be effective in being part of moving this conversation forward, please hold us accountable, because we want to be held accountable in order for us to be effective allies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you for those words. We will begin this conversation with a short video regarding reparations titled House Bill 40, A National Plan for Reparations.
How do you calculate 200 years plus of brutality and murder and violence and the destruction of family and the lack of transfer of wealth? How do you calculate that? How do you calculate that for the descendants of enslaved Africans?
Conversations about the damages caused by the enslavement of Black people and the discriminatory and racist policies that came after emancipation are not new. But as the US continues to reckon with racial injustice, there's a renewed push to figure out how reparations can become a reality.
I think we're at a moment when the nation knows it cannot continue any longer without addressing the original sin, not my neighbor, not my fellow Texan, but the United States government that sanctioned this horrific act and continued disparities against the descendants of enslaved Africans, Black Americans, African Americans, from redlining to denial of loans.
This is Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. She's served as the representative for Texas's 18th district since 1995. Congresswoman Jackson Lee is the main sponsor of a bill which is meant to address reparations on a national scale. It's called H.R. 40.
What it says is that we will establish this, appointed by the leaders of the House and Senate and the President of the United States, and we will provide a vast opportunity for data collection and witnesses and testimony and going around the nation and finding out, how do you address this question?
Basically, the bill establishes a commission that would create national reparations proposals that focus on which African Americans should be paid and how. The creators of the bill say it's the first of its kind to address slavery directly at a national level.
Some communities are saying, well, we want to pay reparations, so here's a jobs bill. Well, no, that's maybe good public policy, maybe necessary, maybe important, but it's not reparations.
That's Dr. Ron Daniels. He's the president and founder of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century and the convener of the National African American Reparations Commission. He's been part of the fight to pass H.R. 40 for decades.
H.R. 40 strikes at the heart, the essence of structural institutional racism in these United States of America.
But critics of the bill have often taken issue with the perceived costs and what they say is a complicated process.
Putting aside the injustice of monetary reparations from current taxpayers for the sins of a small subset of Americans from many generations ago, let me finish. The fair distribution of reparations would be nearly impossible once one considers the complexity of the American struggle to abolish slavery.
I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago for whom none of us currently living are responsible is a good idea. We've tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African-American president.
But remember, this bill for reparations isn't just about what took place during slavery. It's also about the racially discriminatory and exclusionary policies that took place after emancipation.
We have to get people to understand what we're talking about. It's not an indictment of individuals, even though we obviously have some people who are individually hateful and prejudiced and racist in their behavior, but we're talking about much more than that. We're talking about something bigger than that in terms of having people understand that we are where we are today in this country because of this historical tragedy that occurred.
But despite the critics, Jackson Lee's support for the bill has begun to increase. When it was first introduced in 1989, the bill garnered 24 co-sponsors. As of October 2020, the bill currently has 157. All of the co-sponsors are within the Democratic Party.
I believe this moment in history where the racial divide is being stoked and more people are throwing gasoline on fire, I think we're all trying to find a way where we can link arms and have Congress in some way be part of the solution.
And certainly the lynching, the public lynching of George Floyd, and the pandemic of racialized murders by state-sponsored actors. I mean, it has birthed this huge movement under the auspices of Black Lives Matter.
But it wasn't always like that. Reparations is a centuries-old movement in the US. In fact, H.R. 40 draws its name from the very first form of reparations for slavery in the US, which was introduced in January of 1865, before the Civil War even ended.
It was the idea from General Sherman to take 400,000 acres and to divide it with 40 acres and a mule. And for people to understand, that was money, that was wealth, that was giving 40 acres and mobility. A mule was mobility. And that was, in essence, to say, we were at fault, this was heinous, this was horrible, this was brutal, and this is a response to that.
But the order was stopped when Andrew Johnson took office after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Rather than grant the 40 acres and a mule, Johnson gave the land back to its former Confederate owners. And formerly enslaved people were never given their payments. Over a century went by, and in 1989, Congressman John Conyers introduced the first version of H.R. 40 to Congress. Keep in mind that this was just a year after Japanese Americans were granted reparations for being forced into internment camps during World War II.
You're always going to hear members of Congress tell you we can't afford it, that the time isn't right, that there are 1,000 reasons why this should not be done right now.
That's John Tateishi. He was at the forefront of the fight for Japanese American reparations.
I mean, everyone told me that this is doomed to failure. Don't do it. And it's an impossibility. And it was. I mean, I knew that it was an impossibility because no one had ever done this, not at this scale. And so I knew trying to achieve this was going to be an impossible challenge. But, you know, my feeling was, well, we'll take it as far as we can.
Tateishi says he and Conyers discussed reparations for slavery during H.R. 40's creation, and says Conyers initially intended for the bill to address the lost reparations of 1865. But support for reparations for the brutality of enslaving Africans in the US was small in the late 1980s. So instead, the bill served as an introduction to the topic.
As a member of the Judiciary Committee, the first African American on the House Judiciary Committee in its history, it became very clear that as we struggle with the questions of civil rights, affirmative action, equality of opportunity, there must be some historical cognition on our part about the whole question of reparations.
In the meantime, several people across the country took to suing the national government for reparations, with mixed levels of success. And Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush acknowledged the atrocities of slavery in statements that received mixed responses across the country. On June 18, 2009, the 111th Congress issued a statement apologizing for the impacts of the institution of slavery and Jim Crow-era laws on Black communities in the US. And in 2017, H.R. 40 transitioned from a study of if reparations should happen to one of how it could happen. 2 years later, on June 19, 2019, the bill was brought for its first hearing in Congress in 12 years.
In H.R. 40, this body has a chance to both make good on its 2009 apology for enslavement and reject fair weather patriotism to say that a nation is both its credits and its debits. That if Thomas Jefferson matters, so does Sally Hemings. That if D-Day matters, so does Black Wall Street. That if Valley Forge matters, so does Fort Pillow. Because the question really is not whether we will be tied to the somethings of our past, but whether we are courageous enough to be tied to the whole of them. Thank you.
The bill has never reached a vote in the House of Representatives. But as protests for racial justice have taken hold across the US, so has a renewed focus on the bill. Even with recently renewed support for the bill in Congress, both Jackson Lee and Daniels say it's unlikely to pass without more public support.
Gen Z and millennials have been motivating forces in saying why we can't wait. And so I thought if we could do this in a sense of healing racial divide, now more than any moment in history, I believe it is appropriate. But I've always taken it seriously. I've always sought for my colleagues to take it seriously. And I've always gone to those who don't look like me, not in anger or anguish, but in a way of saying, you want to do this because America is better than this.
Thank you. This is what I would say about folk when they say that something can't be done. Nelson Mandela said it the best. It always seems impossible until it's done, okay? So our next speaker is Dr. Ahmad, Nina Ahmad. She will provide an intersectional feminism perspective, which will include why this is important in the discussion of reparations, and define intersectional feminism, particularly making a distinction regarding its misuse. Nina, you're next.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. Once again, I am really privileged to be here in this conversation. And I preface my comments first by saying, historically, there is no other group of people who have been subjected to such hostilities and brutalities and those continuing effects today as much as Black people in our country. I speak today as an ally, as a non-Black woman of color. I'm a product of colonization of South Asia by the British, which began in the 1600s, sort of parallel to what was happening here, and which started off as a trading company, and then the British government took over. But the main thing to remember is, I come from the small country of Bangladesh that was created much, much later. However, there was significant oppression, but the difference in the oppression was, it was of people who still lived and were enslaved in their own homeland. We knew where to escape. We knew what the landscape looked like. We knew where places were that we could go to. Unlike the experience of Africans who were kidnapped and enslaved and brought to a foreign land. That is such a significant difference in how you experience oppression when you have no way to escape, no place to go. So I just want that to be the frame of saying that while I might have known some oppression, it is nothing compared to what is being felt today here. And today's conversation is about reparations. And my specific concern is that enslaved women were affected by the same conditions as enslaved men. Consequently, their descendants have interest in remedying the impacts of slavery, their ability to secure quality employment, housing, and education. However, these issues have been defined by the male experience of slavery and exclude the analysis of the effects of women slaves and the sexual and reproductive abuse that they experienced. So I just want to be clear, there are going to be some trigger words used, particularly the word rape. So I'm just warning the audience ahead of time. And as was mentioned earlier by Christian, and she clarified the term intersectionality. And I want to use that because that is of critical importance in what we're discussing today, and that there's a lack of that in all the discussions around reparations. The term was initially coined by the critical race and gender studies professor, Kimberly Crenshaw, in 1989. She explained that intersectionality is an idea that people experience oppression in a number of different ways in various aspects of life that are often interconnected, and they experience it at the same time. For example, Black women face both racism and sexism within society. So instead of seeing them as separate experiences, intersectionality demands that these experiences of Black women, that we think of them in that context at the same time. So you can't really separate one from the other. There has been a lot of conversation using the term intersectionality, and it's becoming a performative concept that some people subscribe to in order to show that they're being inclusive and progressive. So we just want to make sure that people understand where they're coming to the conversation using that word and what is the genesis of the word. It's really, really important. Reparation is taken by the state to redress gross and systemic violations of human rights and humanitarian law through the administration of some form of compensation or restitution to the victims. And the idea behind intersectionality is that the experiences of Black women must be understood through these multiple forms of oppression that operate simultaneously. And with regards to reparations, this would be used to recognize the multifaceted forms of oppression Black women continually undergo. I bring my experience of having lived through a war. I'm a survivor of a bloody war of liberation that created the country of Bangladesh, and that happened in 1971. And as a child, I heard about the sexual violence that was used as a tool of war. In nine months, 3 million people were killed and 200,000 women and girls were raped as a tool of war. And that is a conservative estimate. There actually were more. And my lived experience of having this kind of situation, and after the War of Liberation, after the new country was formed, the father of the country actually acknowledged and articulated the sacrifice of the women who had undergone this abuse. However, society did not give them much room. And so a lot of women committed suicide. There was a lot of infanticide, and it still continues today that the role of those women have not been uplifted. And I'm drawing that parallel that we have had women in part of this enslavement process, and the extra burden that they bore of the sexual violence is something that needs to be articulated in the conversation of reparations. And when I think, the slavery of enslaved women in US over hundreds of years, it still continues today in so many different ways. And yet we have not had a huge uprising. I would think that we should all be on the streets talking about this, sitting down and stopping all conversation till we have addressed these grave ills that people have faced and continue to face. So when you look at the literature around reparations, we see the centerpiece of reparations are all around past and present, are about the critical understanding of the impact, but there's no role and no conversation around that on women. There's one author that I want to uplift, and we're going to have a set of resources that you'll receive later. Pamela Bridgewater, she did a paper that was called Ain't I a Slave? And that was about slavery, reproductive abuse, and reparations. And that was part of the UCLA Women's Law Journal. It was a while ago in 2005. And she talks about the historical amnesia around this issue. And I don't know that it's very deliberate, this amnesia, because the issues are far-reaching when we talk about employment and all of that. It's true for both genders. But the specific issues, the issues that the reproductive abuse and violence that women faced in that system, particularly to be used to breed new slaves. When the slavery was outlawed in terms that you could not import slaves, that's when this took heightened role, right? So this conversation is to recognize all of that, to recognize how women were used to produce new slaves who weren't imported. And the slave owners and holders, because this was an investment from their perspective, was ready to wait that time it took for those children to grow up. That was the level of investment people made in order to enslave and use the labor of enslaved people. And we must recognize that in what that cost was, not just to that unpaid labor, but think about what it did to the woman who had to bear these children, right? And this, that is the time when women just didn't sit down. They had a lot of methods they tried to employ to stop this, which cost them their lives, which cost them the lives of those children. So there was resistance, but it was so difficult to do what they needed to do because that whole system had to be upturned. So when we talk about what is happening today, hopefully this HB 40 is going to go forward and we are going to have movement on this and we're going to hear much more about this. I just want to make sure that the scholars and the discussion that has happened has excluded the enslaved woman's experience. And so as a result, we have less data pertaining to what that experience was. And we have to yet have African-American women acquire a coherent legal doctrine to which to address the modern manifestations of the enslaved woman's sexual and reproductive abuse. So I'm probably close to the end of my time, but there are many speakers in front of me who are going to address different aspects of it. But as a member of the National Board of NOW, and as someone who used to be a local president, and someone who just ran for an election, who understood the issues that face women. I just ran for Auditor General. I was the Democratic nominee. I came within 3 points of actually winning the election. But all of this builds into the narrative of what a woman faces. Here I am, an immigrant woman, not someone who's enslaved, but a person with a history of being enslaved, like Black women. But that solidarity we build across those lines to understand what repression looks like and what are the impacts of that in modern day is what we really want to unpack. And as Christian said, that is part of our priority as the National Organization for Women. So thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to many more conversations.
Thank you so much, Nina, for that perspective of intersectionality as it pertains to reparations. Our next speaker or panelist is Attorney Michael Coard, and he will provide a historical overview and the case for reparations for the 21st century. Michael.
Thank you very much for introducing me, and thank you even more for allowing me to be a part of this panel. I'm looking at the clock because I tend to turn minutes into hours, but I'm sure I'm going to keep it to 10 minutes. It's now 2:37, so I will make sure I stick to that. I want to make sure I set forth 6 key points in connection with my presentation. But before I lay out those 6, let me define for folks who don't know what we mean by reparations. Reparations is about making up for a wrong. It's about restoring to a good condition. In terms of making up for a wrong and restoring to a good condition, I guess the best way to describe it is this: reparations is all about putting Black people where they would have been had they not been enslaved from 1619 to 1865. It's as simple as that. Look at other ethnic groups, Irish folks and English folks and German folks and Polish folks and Jewish folks. Look at all the different groups and see where they are in society. You have to ask yourself, why is it that Black people are at the bottom of every category? Education, income, home ownership. Is it because we're genetically predisposed to be at the bottom? Or is there something societally, something in this system that put us there? And there's one thing that we've been through that nobody else, with all the horrors other ethnic groups have dealt with, nothing close. And here's the proof. If you ask anybody from any other ethnic group, would you change the experience of your ancestors from 1619 to 1865 with my ancestors? Keeping in mind the hell that your ancestors went through, would you exchange that for ours, 1619, 1865? And the answer is obvious. So that needs to be repaired. Here are the 6 points. First point, when we look at HR 40, it doesn't say every Black person in America, man, woman, and child, is going to get $1 billion. Doesn't say we're going to get $1 million. Doesn't say we're going to get a dime, because HR 40 is not about giving Black people anything. It's about creating a commission to study it. How could you oppose that? How could any reasonable person oppose that? Because if reparations is not a good idea, the commission will conclude that. So number one, HR 40 simply calls for the creation of a commission to study reparations. That's all, number one of the 6. Number 2, and here's where I put my lawyer hat on. Many people make the argument that in 2020, there is no white person alive who enslaved any Black person. They also argue there's no Black person alive who was ever enslaved. And I say, yeah, that's a great argument. And superficially, it might seem to be a persuasive argument, but it's not. And here's where the lawyer thing comes in. There's something in the law called unjust enrichment. The theory of unjust enrichment means even though you didn't steal it, you're responsible for it. Here's a prime example. Let's say I, Michael Coard, walking down Broad Street. I'm Broad and Chestnut in 2020. I see a white guy walking toward me. And as he walks past me, I notice he has a beautiful watch on. And I say to the gentleman, hey, sir, that's a great watch you got. Can I take a look at it? He's proud of it. He says, yes. He takes it off. He shows me the watch. When I look at the watch, I see on the back, it says, property of Michael Coard I, 1723. And I say to the guy, hey, it says property of Michael Coard I, 1723. I'm Michael Coard X. I asked the white guy, where'd you get that watch from? He says, I got it from my father. Where'd your father get that watch from? He got it from his father. And as we stand there and talk, we find out that his great-great-grandfather stole my great-great-grandfather's watch. So under the theory of unjust enrichment, even though that guy in 2020 didn't steal the watch, even though Michael Coard didn't own the watch, the person who was unjustly enriched by that watch has to give it up. So that destroys the argument that there's no white person alive today who enslaved anybody, because the white guy didn't steal the watch. That destroys the argument that there's no Black person alive who was enslaved, because I wasn't. So the theory of unjust enrichment destroys that. Let's get to number 3 of the 6. Even though we often talk about reparations in terms of slavery, it's bigger than slavery, because it's not as if we were enslaved from August 25, 1619 until December of 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment. And then once that 13th Amendment was passed, Black folks left the plantation and went straight to Harvard University or moved on the main line. It didn't happen like that. After slavery were the Black codes. After Black codes was the Redemption era. After Redemption era was Jim Crow. So we're talking about the Black codes, 1865, Jim Crow ending about 1965. So it's not just about slavery from 1619 to 1865. It's about the spawn, the product of slavery being the Redemption era, Black codes, and Jim Crow. Having said that, let me quickly get to number 4. I can't believe it. I'm on track, on time. I got 4 minutes left, and I'm going to make sure I get it all in. That was number 3. Number 4, many people say, well, you Black people in 2020, you just want a handout. You all have always been lazy and shiftless. And I'm like, lazy and shiftless? We worked from can't see in the morning to can't see at night 7 days a week, not only from 1619 to 1865, but up through Jim Crow and sharecropping and convict leasing, which really didn't end until the early 1960s. And even beyond that, we built America. We built the White House in 1792. We built the US Capitol in 1793. We built George Washington's Mount Vernon, Virginia plantation in 1758. We built Thomas Jefferson's Monticello plantation in 1772. We built Wall Street in New York in 1652. And not only did we build it in 1652, it was actually a slave auction site from 1711 for about 50 years until 1762. So don't call us lazy and shiftless. You look at America and you can make the argument that at least economically, America is one of the most powerful countries on the planet. Okay, call it one of the most powerful countries on the planet. Well, America is like a company. Imagine a company not having to pay people for 246 years. You got this company, and from 1619 to 1865, you don't have to pay employees a dime. Well, you'd be a great company. America is that company. So don't call us lazy and shiftless. And again, I'm going to make sure I wrap this up in 2 minutes. Then we get to number 5, money. Reparations is not about money. It can't be about money, because there's no amount of money in the world that my ancestors on the shores of West Africa would have said in the 1600s, hey, you can take my children, you can take my grandchildren, you can take my great-great-grandchildren, so on and so forth. You can rape me, you can castrate me, you can whip me, you can slaughter me, you can commit wholesale genocide, you can take my land, my language, my religion, you can do all of that stuff. And then in 2020, just give me $1,000. Just give me 10,000. Just give me $1 million. Just give me $1 billion. No, it's not about money. It's about programs and policies. And I'll get to that in just a second. But number 6, people often say, okay, well, exactly who would get reparations? Well, the commission would decide that. But it's so interesting that many white folks in America would ask the question, hey, who do we determine are the recipients of this? Who actually gets reparations? You know, what if your mother's white and your father's black, or your grandmother is white and your grandfather's black? Well, it's so weird, because during slavery, they didn't have any problem with determining who was black. So use the same gauge you used during slavery to enslave people to determine who receives the reparations. And finally, very quickly, there are things in effect right now. And I'm going to wrap this up in 60 seconds. Right now, there's Providence, Rhode Island. There's Asheville, North Carolina, that has a model, not dealing with cash as it shouldn't, but certainly dealing with policies. And here in Pennsylvania, we got State Representative Chris Rabb, who's talking about reparations from a state standpoint. Because when you talk about slavery, it wasn't so much a federal law as it was various state laws. I want to talk more about what Representative Rabb did. I want to talk more about the 6 points I have. If we have more time at the end, we will. But I thank you all for allowing me to take 11 minutes instead of 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you for that historical overview and the impact of slavery on Black folks to this very day. The impact, because a lot of folks think, like you said, that happened back then. It don't impact us. Yeah, it do. It does. So thank you for that. Our next panelist is Brittany Alston, and Brittany will discuss reparations from an economic perspective. What has been the financial cost of slavery and how that has impacted the descendants of slavery and the impact on generational wealth. Brittany.
Thank you so much. And Michael, we appreciate all 11 minutes, so I will try to keep mine to 9. So my name is Brittany Alston. I'm with the Action Center on Race and the Economy. We're a research and campaigning hub that focuses on Wall Street accountability and also racial justice. And you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the need to demand reparations, but also apply an invest-divest framework in all of the work that we're doing. Next slide, please. So like Michael just highlighted, Black folks absolutely deserve and are entitled to material reparations, but this alone does not satisfy the full definition of reparations. The National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, which I saw somebody's on the call from, defines reparations as a process, not just an act. And here's a list in this slide of some of the components of reparations. Reparations are a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of the fundamental human rights. Reparation also requires that the act causing the harm cease to exist. And I think that's a really important point to highlight. It also focuses on direct repair to the directly impacted groups. And lastly, reparations must be accepted by the directly impacted groups. So while varied levels of acknowledgement have been offered, the whole of reparations has not been given to Black folks in this country, and we have to fight for full redress. Next slide, please. So here are some demands that groups like Movement for Black Lives have issued for reparations. And I have highlighted the one that I'm going to focus on most in this conversation. It's reparations for the wealth extracted from our communities in the form of corporate and government reparations, and specifically focusing on the role that financial institutions have played in building an extractive economy. Next slide, please. So we're going to shift really quick because I distinguish between this invest-divest framework and reparations. So invest-divest, or the difference between the two, is that invest-divest often broadens the scope. It focuses on an entire community based on an entity's spending decisions and the lines of business that they may have, while reparations is tracing the harm to a specific group and demands that reparations be targeted to those who were directly impacted by the specific act. So in the case of enslaved Black folks, that would be focusing on slavery and the legacy of slavery. For invest-divest, we can think about sort of how Philly spends its public money. What corporations and governments spend their money on is a direct reflection of their priorities. So in Philly, some of our top expenses are debt service, or the money that we're paying back to Wall Street, and another top expense is policing. Spending money on regressive expenses does not translate into communities where people have their healthcare needs met, high quality housing, jobs, and all of the other things that we really need to thrive. So we need to divest in those systems that harm us and practices and invest in more supportive systems. Next slide. Thank you. So here we see a cycle. So just take a second and look at those different points in the cycle. And in the center of it, we see that there's an extractive economy. And this is a representation of our economy. When we think about how corporations in the finance industry fit into this picture, we see a cycle or circle that influences, creates, and enables wealth extraction from our communities, both at a government level, but also at an individual level. So corporations and banks, they drain our budgets and load us up with debt. So let's think about credit card debt. If you owe $300 for your credit card or a student loan, that's $300 you can't use for groceries or health necessities, but the same goes for governments. Because our cities and us as individuals are loaded up with these different forms of debt and regressive expenses like policing, that's less money for public goods and services. And if there isn't a ton of money in the city to give to a service, then corporations step in with a solution, like corporations owning our public services, and boom, we're trapped in this system again. This is the current cycle created by racialized capitalism, but this country was founded on racism and extractive and exploitive industries. Next slide. So I've heard both Nina and Michael talk about this a little bit, but there's no way to sugarcoat Wall Street's history. Exploitation has been at the heart of Wall Street from the beginning. It's been racist. It started off as a slave trading post. So in the 1820s, Wall Street was actually collateralizing loans for slave owners. This means that bonds were asset-backed, with the enslaved people as the asset. It allowed creditors to pool all of this debt together from different borrowers and reduce the risk. So banks like JP Morgan Chase and creditors, They accepted enslaved Black people as collateral for those loans, and they were also granted the authorization to repossess them if the loan defaulted. And by them, I mean the enslaved Black folks. Next slide, please. And so you can actually see a list of some of the loans, and the loans are the names of enslaved Black folks owned by different slave owners. And this fueled an increase in the share of enslaved people as a share of all US wealth through the mid-1860s. The system relied on the reproduction of labor by enslaved women. They were subject to assault, harassment, rape, and forced childbearing to ensure racialized capitalism could continue and slave owners could profit. And Nina talked about this so beautifully. So we have to acknowledge this foundation of our current predatory racist banking system. Next slide, please. So Wall Street and the 1%, they spend billions in lobbying and campaign contributions in an attempt to rig the system and just extract more and more wealth from the rest of us. Historically, Wall Street and corporate allies, they've reinforced racist and misogynistic policymaking by painting working families, especially women of color and mothers of color, as drains on our public services and systems. So you see some of the different sort of highlights here. We've seen this through terminology like welfare queens made popular by Reagan, but really we know that the primary drains on the system are Wall Street and large corporations that have these deep legacies that started in slavery. Next slide, please. In concert with other actors, Wall Street predatory lending has practiced predatory lending and also dictated where we lived in our current segregation patterns within different communities. So in the 30s, mortgage lenders, they were drawing these red lines, and this is a red line map of Philly, around portions of maps to indicate neighborhoods in which they did not want people to make loans. And this was called redlining. And Black folks suffered as a result, and it limited their housing opportunities, both now, but also in the past. But banks are just finding new ways to practice old tricks. Next slide, please. So, you know, some of this stuff, I think, especially in conversations with folks who are younger, are like, oh my goodness, this stuff happened so long ago. No, right? The legacy of these things is still happening right now. In 2017, Philly actually filed a lawsuit against Wells Fargo for violating the Fair Housing Act by taking advantage of minority borrowers to maximize profit. And we see this in the municipal lending market also. So in the 20 years after World War II, there were relatively low interest rates, and that was because of the war. Local governments borrowed billions through bonds, and that really fattened the profits of Wall Street profiteers. But non-white communities, they did not benefit from this low interest rate environment. So what does that mean? That means that Black children in cities around the country, they couldn't attend high quality funded schools. Streets went unpaved. There were not adequate parks. There were not adequate recreational facilities in a lot of Black neighborhoods. And that sounds similar to the conversations that we've had, especially conversations around defunding the police. And Philly is actually currently engaged in a lawsuit against a host of big banks for artificially inflating interest rates on our city bonds. The municipal bond market has a host of issues, but time and time again, we see Wall Street proves to be extractive. They peddle debt to our communities, especially communities facing economic hardship, and they load them up with debt that we cannot afford. And when cities begin to struggle, Wall Street offers these same predatory solutions that cost us money and make them richer. So in closing, we see that we've allowed Wall Street banks and big corporations to cause harm in our communities for far too long. And the importance of employing both that invest, divest framework and reparations demands is so that we can truly recoup what is ours. Reparations calls for the cessation of these harmful activities. So a true reparations demand on Wall Street and big corporations and even our government would challenge us to restructure our economy and shift power toward public institutions and community-based programs. And that requires a deep redistribution of wealth, and it pushes us toward true self-determination and economic freedom. I hope any questions that you have, you can throw in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them as we go through. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brittany, for that perspective on the financial cost of slavery and how it has impacted and continues to impact the descendants of slavery. Thank you so much. Now, our final panelist for today is Congressman Dwight Evans, who is the co-sponsor of House Bill 40, HR 40, I'm sorry. And he's going to discuss the status of that bill and the prospects for passage in 2021 and what people can do to advocate for this passage. Congressman, you're next.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And I thank all of you for this enlightening discussion. It is very appropriate to have this discussion. There's been many years that I've been involved in this movement. Even when I was in the state legislature, I say to you that that's how far I've been in it, how far I've watched. Back in the days of, some of you may remember David P. Richardson, who was a catalyst in the beginning when we attempted to do at the state level. Now to be at the federal level, it is rather interesting. Starting out with John Conyers from Michigan, who was the first person to introduce, for the great state of Michigan, to introduce HR 40. Obviously, John Conyers is no longer alive, and he was a real force on this, and he laid it on the forefront on the need that we need to have this framework in this discussion. As a result of him dying, another good colleague of mine, Sheila Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas, Houston in particular, she took over Barbara Jordan's place. Not that anybody could take Barbara Jordan's place, but Sheila Lee Jackson took it over. For the first time ever in United States Congress history, there was a public hearing. There was a public hearing around reparation. That had never happened. And in my time in Harrisburg, that never happened. So I had the chance to experience where the House Judiciary Committee, which has been around 200 years, had a hearing from a federal policy standpoint about the United States government dealing with the issue of reparation. And it was a very interesting hearing. There was a lot of discussions. I believe as a result of that hearing, for the first time in the Democratic primary, which we just had, all 17 candidates that was running for president of the United States had publicly declared that they would sign it if it became law. All 17. Understand the significance of the fact that all 17 candidates who talked about trying to be the nominee would have signed that particular bill. Pennsylvania is in a rather unique position relating to the whole debate around reparation, because we're fortunate to have had two Congresspeople, Robert N.C. Nix, who was a chairman of a major committee, the Post Office Committee, was the first congressman ever elected in Pennsylvania in 1958. I was 4 years old when he was elected. The next congressman was Congressman Gray, who went on to become the first budget chair, the first African-American budget chair, and the first African-American whip in the United States Congress. Those two congressmen set the tone to what I'm going to talk to you about today as we move towards this framework. And I'd like to tell you about what I think are some of the things happening as a result of the framework being laid. We voted on a major bill just on Friday called the Moores Act. Other states have been moving about legalizing cannabis. For the first time, the national government in the House of Representatives talked about legalizing cannabis. And I bring that issue up to you because of the impact that it has had specifically around people of color relating to the criminal justice system. Michael Coard was just on, he could talk about what the criminal justice system by having a war on drugs and what the impact is mean, particularly to the Black community. The other issue we'll vote on this week coming is relating to national defense. For the first time, there's going to be a bill passed that will strip the names of any individual that was a part of the Confederacy. Now, that never happened before. That's going to happen. And ironically, the person going to sign it is Donald Trump. And I say that to you is that's a part of the whole reparation discussions. Those individuals who were traitors to the country for the first time will be pointed out. And a congressman from Maryland, Anthony Brown, was the one who's led that effort in terms of. So the issue that I described to you around the drug issue, the issue around the military, are all, in my view, a part of this discussion around reparations in terms of correcting the wrongs that have taken place. The issue about mass incarceration, the fact of the drug war has been a failure and it's been done on the back of Black people, is clearly that that's an issue. So right now, where is the bill? The bill right now, though it has been brought up for a hearing, I do not believe this particular year it will be able to be voted on. We're in Congress about another 2 weeks. Then we have new session start January 3rd. More likely, Sheila Lee will reintroduce the bill and begin to try to work. The key element is because the Democrats are in the majority. That's the key element. So what has it done? For the first time, you have a woman of color who will be vice president of the United States. I believe that this struggle, like you're leading today, are factors that make a difference and match it. I believe it starts at the local level and it influences the national level, like what you're doing today. That is extremely essential to bring it home about the impact of what is happening. Now, I'm going to close with this because one of my heroes is Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass always talked about power will concede nothing without a struggle. That's what this has to be, because it is a struggle. It will only happen when we are relentless in having this conversation today. So I indicate to you that we're having the discussion. The bill is in a committee like we never had before. You see the actions about criminal justice. You see the action about the judiciary as well as the military. All of these efforts we're going to have to keep going on. So the key to it, as John Lewis would say, is that the only way you're going to do is have some good trouble. I thank you very much.
Vanessa, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'm here. So I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists for your insightful, helpful discussion on reparations. And now we have to like the congressman just said, we now have to get into some good trouble, y'all. And we need to start organizing and working right now towards this becoming a reality, okay? And trust me, because Dwight Evans, Congressman, knows my background as an organizer with unions, so you know I'm going to get it done. So thank you all again. Go ahead, you were going to say something?
That's what it's about, organizing.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I now turn the program over to Beth Finn, the co-moderator, and she will open the floor to questions. Thank you all again.
Thank you, Vanessa, and hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Beth Finn. I'm the president of Pennsylvania Now, and I'm a board member for Americans for Democratic Action Southeastern Pennsylvania chapter. We've been getting some questions coming in. I'm going to ask our panelists to please turn your video on so we can see you as you answer these questions that have been coming in. Thanks. And I'm going to start. We had a few questions come in before the webinar started, and we have a few that are in the Q&A box now. So I'm just going to kind of go back and forth between them. And whoever feels like they can answer the question, please jump in. Although I think the first one here will be for you, Congressman Evans. The question is, you sort of addressed this, when and how soon will the bill now be voted on? So I'm going to change it a little to say, do you think that it will come to a vote in the next session of Congress? And a second part to that question is, do we have any Black entertainer support, and how many other Congress people are supporting the bill?
I can't answer the question about entertainers, but I do believe it is a possibility for it to come to the vote in the new session. It has had a hearing. You heard what all the various presidential candidates have said. Now the nominee of President-elect Biden with Senator-elect Harris as vice president. I believe we're in the position. I think we have to keep the pressure on. It's very clear there's over 60 members of the Congressional Black Caucus. We have Jim Clyburn, who is the whip of the United States, Hakeem Jeffries, who is the caucus chair, and Barbara Lee, who is the co-chair of the steering committee. So we're in the position, in my view, and I've only been there 4 years, I've never seen a better position that we are in. And that's why I made the connection with you that it's appropriate that you are doing this discussion at this particular time, because this is a bottom-up approach. This is a bottom-up approach that you're doing this in December, I should say. But it's important just to remember to keep the pressure on and be relentless about staying alive on this issue.
Quick follow-up, Beth, to Congressman Evans. Of the congressional delegation from Pennsylvania, how many have not signed on?
That's a good question. I can't tell you. I'm speculating that no Republicans have signed on.
Okay.
I can't tell you about the Democrats. I mean, that's probably public information. You can just check the record. But
the reason I ask is because we can do something right now to address those who might not have signed on locally in Pennsylvania. We have linked to a petition for that has been put, I think, out in the chat somewhere, and we'll send this out to our people who signed on to this event. And then we could actually target people who are sympathetic to this in districts that have congressional people who have not signed on, and then make a real focus of that, right? So we can do that legwork and set up a system where people who live in districts where their congressional representative has not signed up, regardless of whether they're Democrats or Republicans, we need to push that. And that actually brings the issue to the forefront. I think we need to get some press around this about highlighting who hasn't signed on and asking them why haven't they signed on. So we really need to have some organizational structure here, and everybody on this call who are guests or panelists are probably also connected to many of you are connected to organizations which all have membership. So if we can at least have one outcome from this event outside of further conversations that will be coming up, is actually to push our representatives to sign on to the HB 40 right away.
Yeah. Looking at the bill information online, it looks like there are 4 Congresspeople from Pennsylvania who've signed on: Congressman Evans, Congressman Boyle, and Congresswomen Dean and Scanlon. So if you are represented by somebody other than those 4, it's definitely worth a phone call to them.
And it's key, the 2 names you mentioned, Congresswoman Scanlon, she's vice chair of the Judiciary Committee, and Congresswoman Dean is on the committee. So those 2, are people who in the committee when it happened, they are involved directly with the hearing process. So both from there.
Great. Okay, so the next question we have here, and this might be a tricky one and maybe not easy to answer in the small amount of time we have, but I'll open it up to the panel. How do you heal a race-based injury with a class-based solution? Anybody want to tackle that? Maybe.
Well, I use the example of I use those 2 examples. I described to you about the drug issues, the war on drugs. I use that, and we just passed. This is the first time ever in the United States Congress that there's ever been passed on the marijuana policy. about 20-something states, have taken action, but never as a national policy. There's always been this inconsistency between marijuana and cocaine. For years, there's always been in terms of how individuals are treated regarding their behavior when it comes, if one is caught, one is not caught, in terms of how they go to prison. So around that policy, that is a policy that's long overdue that needed to be dealt with. That to me relates to your question, because when you really think about it, when you think about the mass incarceration of African Americans in prison and individuals who may have sold some marijuana and they wind up in jail for life or other kinds of conditions, the fact of the matter, that's to me the clearest one that you have. The second one, which I also mentioned to you, is the issue around traders who have their names, like Fort Bragg, have their names on buildings or things of that nature on the military. They should not have their name. So though this hearing or this commission will be great for the discussion, the reality of it will be all of the commissions in Congress that basically will have their hands in everything. You can talk about education, criminal justice. I heard economics mentioned earlier. All those things need to be addressed. So this is an ongoing struggle to attempt to address this.
And very quickly, what I would add to that is, if I understand the question correctly, how do you resolve a race-based problem with a class-based solution? You take a page out of the Nike book, you just do it. And what I mean by just doing it is, for example, as an attorney, where I've handled wrongful death cases, you go to the jury and you say, hey, what this person did, in many cases, police brutality, what these police officers did to cause the death of this person is just horrible. And I'm saying to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is that worth $1,000? Is it worth 10,000, 100,000, $1 million? Let's say it's worth $1 billion. That's not enough, but it's all we can do right now. If we could bring the person back, we would bring him back, but we can't bring him back. So you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have to just do it. And the thing that you do is to compensate the family. The other thing, when you talk about a race-based problem and a class-based solution, you look at the common denominator. Who is in that race that is also amongst a class of people who are oppressed? That's Black folks. So you look at the race, that's Black folks. You look at the oppressed class, that's Black folks. So you have to do something. I wish we could go back in time and make slavery non-existent. We can't do that. So all we can do now is to repair through reparations. So that's how you do it. You just do it.
Beth, can I add one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the other things that I would just highlight is that separating the conversation into race and class doesn't really paint the full picture of like the economic structure that slavery was built on. So when we talk about reparations for slavery, we're actually talking about an economy that was completely extractive, and slavery in and of itself is not a race-based problem. We created class based on race. And so now we're looking to tackle a problem that is both race, class, and, as Nina spoke about, intersectional in these other ways. And I also think that when we talk about reparations in the context of this conversation, we've been talking about the legislation of HB 40, but reparations is a huge umbrella for, repairing the wrongs to economic ills, but also through environmental ills, right? And so there are responsibilities that corporations have to repay the ills that they've created in Black communities and brown communities. And that too is a form of reparations if structured properly with the components that we've walked through today. So I would just push us to also think about reparations as something that is intersectional in and of itself and not just a race or a class issue.
And I think
You could take Georgetown University as an example. The fact that they stepped forward and said what they said, that's just one example to that conversation, how they benefited from slavery.
And another very timely conversation is about the legalization of marijuana. Is not only is it about the decriminalization and letting people, letting people who have been incarcerated because of that, but it's actually about making available licenses to operate these, whether there are dispensaries or when they become, recreational one. Where is the legislation to actually address the high price of those licenses, and how do we make sure people have equal access to them? That is something that I believe we need to put in and codify as we're going forward to talk about access to capital to even afford those licenses. That's going to, we already have people who know how to deal drugs. I mean, we're just legalizing that, right? And we're saying we already have MBAs. I call them street MBAs, our street drug dealers. They already have all the skill set that you need. What they don't have is the capital. What they don't have is access to those licenses. So we have to be deliberate if we want to intersect the class with the race right here in a real life example right in front of us. Because right now in Pennsylvania, if you look at who owns those licenses, take a good look at who those are. Take a good look at who was allowed to have them. Take a good look, where was our legislature, state and federal, to talk about that and to insert that. Because, we can take baby steps, but people's lives are being destroyed right now as we speak. People are dying right now as we speak. So this is just another example of the immediacy and the urgency of now. And this is an opportunity with this new administration coming in. Show us what you're worth if you're going to actually put the capital to make sure the corner street hustler is able to buy that license. That's what people want.
It's interesting, Nina, saying that, because that was exactly my bill called the Homegrown Act. I'm vice chair of the Small Business Committee. And that was in the Homegrown Act. The first time ever anything like that passed. This first time I ever voted in Congress. So I share with you what you just described is in this package called the Moores Act. If you look it up, y'all look it up, you will see those specifics regarding economics. Because I agree, if you don't address the question about economics and the equity question, you do nothing about addressing this problem.
Well, that turned into a great discussion after all from that meaty question. And I think it's a good segue to this next question. We've seen corporations pledging over $35 billion recently to racial inequality initiatives, but a lot of the money has gone to white-led organizations or national Black organizations. I think I'm reading this correctly. How can we hold these corporations to standards of accountability to make sure that they're using that money to actually help the people it's intended to?
The Urban League has an initiative. I'm very proud of that. They borrowed a page, if you don't World War II, they had something called the Marshall Plan regarding Europe. And the Urban League, if you look up, they have they say there needs to be a Marshall Plan for Black America. Now, we just passed 2 bills that deal with the CARES Act and the HEROES Act because of the pandemic. That is what we haven't done for America. So we need to take, if you look at the Urban League, they have this initiative called the Marshall Plan, formed the alliance with the Congressional Black Caucus. And it is the mergings of together that. So you want to take what we have done in Congress regarding the CARES Act or the HEROES Act, addressing the pandemic, and you want to do that normally. That's what as the president-elect talks about building it back better, that is what that's a part of building it back better. That's in all of this conversation. There's an interesting book written by Julius Wilson, who is a sociologist, And he talks about when work disappeared. And you can see that's definitely an effect that is had, particularly around African-American males. If you take Bud Company, for example, the disappearance of Bud Company, which used to feed into Detroit and manufacturing cars, you can see the exact impact, the economic impact that has had socially, financially, and family-wise as a result of those disappearance of those blue-collar jobs.
I can also say that, you know, I may be pessimistic here, but corporations are not going to get us free. So I think that, like, back to this idea of doing deep organizing with these grassroots groups is extremely important. I think that corporations often pledge fractions on fractions of pennies of their revenue streams to these initiatives. But while they do give this money, and it is money, you know, even organizations like the ones that I belong to use to build power, we have to recognize that we aren't beholden to those pennies, and that we still have to challenge the power systems that they are a part of, and we have to break them down when and where we can, whether it be through voting, whether it be through organizing, but there has to be different ways that we're engaging to push our power toward public institutions so that these corporations are not continued to put up on a pedestal and just reinforce that cycle that we are trapped in as a community because they are looking to gain profit at the end of the day.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one or maybe two more questions. I think this one's straightforward. Is there a nationwide grassroots effort on this issue? I don't know, Michael, if you know the answer to that.
The answer is yes. I mean, if there is one organization that's leading this battle, whether you agree with everything it does or doesn't, it's NCOBRA. So I would simply encourage folks to Google NCOBRA, at least as a starting point. And for many people, it's an ending point as well, because it includes a whole lot of resources in connection with this. So my suggestion is NCOBRA.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more. Has there been any thought or movement to reach out to ethnic groups who have received reparations in modern history, such as Jews and Japanese Americans? This may be important for creating more alliances and allies.
You know, in that video, there was a Japanese American who actually spoke to it. And when 9/11 happened, right after then, and also when Trump was elected and the Muslim ban had happened, it was Japanese Americans who came to the forefront as unimpacted community who had, you know, previously faced something like that. So I know they have stood up, but they're a very small community. So, you know, in terms of their numbers in the US, I think taking lessons learned to apply is a good thing always, to shape what is different in different communities. But at the end of the day, this is about ownership and about getting people to feel vested in this, you know, particularly young Black folks who feel so divorced from many of this conversation we're having just now. I think we need to find ways, and Brittany is a perfectly great example of getting a young person who has invested the time to understand the mechanics. She is, you know, educated herself in, and she would be a great ambassador. We need many, many Brittany's to reach out to build that power she was talking about. And I think for us old heads, that is what we need to do. And there was another question about corporations. You know, it's really about relinquishing power. And that is about who's actually leading these organizations. Every nonprofit that is led by a white person, and I'm just talking across the board, have they groomed a person of color to take over, particularly if they are tending to the needs of people of color, particularly Black people? Have they done that? If they haven't, that means they're not serious about making that change. Those are small changes. Just yesterday, woman who was leading a white organization about the supermajority, Cecile Richard, she stepped down and a Black woman has taken up that organization. That's a massive new organization. Those are the kinds of moves we need. We have Christian Nunes, you met earlier on. She's now the head of NOW, correct? It came through a fight. We had to get behind that, but that happened. Those are some of the changes that will then tell people, yes, it can happen, because people have to have confidence that these paths actually yield some results. And we have to connect all those results. That work that Michael Coard has done in this city actually tells us about when you have someone who's committed around these issues, you can get results. So we need to connect all those dots. You know, Congressman Evans's bill about the homegrown issue, we have to connect all those dots so people know exactly what wins we have had and how do we expand them. And that's really movement building and information sharing in ways that are accessible.
And if I can just quickly follow up to Nina's point, and I'm so glad she mentioned that, because the group I'm a part of is called ATTAC, A-T-A-C, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition. And we are just a group of regular Black folks from the hood. I mean, no disrespect to great organizations like the NAACP, the Urban League, National Action Network, but a group of angry Black folks in Philadelphia found out that George Washington enslaved Black folks in Philadelphia at America's first White House, and reparations includes telling the story of those 9 here in Philadelphia, telling the story of the 316 in Mount Vernon, Virginia, and creating a monument, a memorial, a museum at 6th and Market.
All right, well, we are just about out of time. I want to turn it over to Jovita Hill to close us out. Jovita, over to you.
Thank you. I am Jovita Hill. I'm the Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Engagement for Women and also the Philadelphia Commission for Women. And I am so honored to have been our office to co-sponsor this event today with NOW. I am so proud to be in the company of good troublemakers. And I want everybody who's listening to be a good troublemaker, because I think we need to keep in mind that there is no gender equity if we don't have racial equity and economic equity. And those 3 things are inextricably tied. And I think about Anna Julia Cooper, one of my favorite writers. She said, only the Black woman can decide when and where I enter, and the whole race enters with me. So I want to be in good company with good troublemakers. And on that note, I'd like to thank some of the good troublemakers who co-hosted this event today. Thank you to all of the wonderful panelists. I also want to say this is only the beginning. This is not the end. We will be continuing this conversation with not just the conversation, but with action. We want to get behind HR 40, and we also want to do something about it, but to continue the conversation around gender equity, racial equity, and economic equity. And on that note, I want to thank our co-sponsors today, along with the National Organization of Women, the Coalition of Labor Union Women, Americans for Democratic Action, Neighborhood Networks, and Xena Women Empowered. And thank you all very much. I also want to remind you again, this is just the beginning, and this is part of the conversation, but we're not going to stop here. And I also would like to let you know that on Martin Luther King Day, we will be hosting, and you will hear more about it, we will be hosting a conversation about violence against women. We think it's really appropriate because Martin Luther King was our patron saint of nonviolence. And so on the day that we recognize MLK, we're going to recognize what's happening in terms of violence against women. So I thank you all for attending today, and you'll be hearing more from us.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Oh, wait a minute. And thank you for shouting out Dave Richardson. He was my very dear friend, and I missed him.
To Beth Finn and Vanessa Fields for coordinating, hosting, doing all of this hard work. We appreciate it. You know, mechanics is what makes things happen. It's the devil in the details. So appreciate all your time and effort. Thanks, everyone.
You're welcome.
Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.